Hello and welcome to Radical Democracy. I'm Maddi Cheers, and I am so pleased to do tonight's show on radically re-examining mental health, and very, very thrilled that our guest, Phil Borgia, am I pronouncing your name right? I hope I said it right, Phil. Excuse me?
Borges.
Borges. Phil Borges.
Borges.
Borges. Like gorgeous. Ooh, that's so good for
bet.
you.
Just put a B in front of it.
Very, very
I've heard that one all my life.
Good, works for you.
Yeah.
I know, it's like Cheers for me. It's very good, although mostly people don't believe that's my name. But so anyway, back to our show. So Phil Borges, thank you so much for being here tonight. Phil is the creator, the director of a film called Crazy Wise, which I just watched again this afternoon. Absolutely phenomenal piece of work. So important. I have a long background. What really hit me in seeing this film again was how much I could relate to my work that I had once done in the mental health field. And I had worked for about 4 years at an outpatient clinic down in Baltimore. And one day came walking in the gentleman who had been the valedictorian of our class, our graduating class in high school, very similar to your character of Adam in Crazy Wise, was an excellent athlete, brilliant mind, sweet, kind, well-liked, very attractive guy. Goes off to MIT, and in his second year in MIT had a nervous breakdown, and lo and behold, ends up in this program. And I remember thinking at the time that this mind is a gift to the world, and what have we done to it? And that was back in the mid-'80s, So to see your film, and when I wrote you at first, I told you the same thing, that your film is just, your film is a gift. Your film is something so necessary for people to really understand about the way we are not treating mental illness. And for nearly 3 decades, Phil has been documenting indigenous and tribal cultures, striving to create an understanding of the challenges they face. His work is in museums and galleries worldwide. He has award-winning books. He is the project that I really want to talk about sometime on another show, Stirring the Fire, has produced several short documentaries and a book and an exhibition highlighting some of the extraordinary women worldwide who are breaking through gender barriers and conventions in order to enhance the well-being of their communities. But this documentary, Phil, Crazy Wise, does definitely reveal a paradigm shift that's changing the way Western culture defines and treats mental illness. The film highlights a survivor. I love that term that these people refer to themselves as survivors. And having worked in the field, I can see why. A survivor-led movement demanding more choices from a mental health care system. In crisis, people really need to know how much of a crisis this is for our mental health care system. Those of you that have been listening a long time know that our main theme on this show is you can't solve a problem using the same mindset that created it. Albert Einstein's famous quote, and if there's anything in our culture to which that quote applies, using the same mindset, it is in the treatment of mental illness. Because it is this culture, it is a society that has largely created the problems that we're seeing in mental illness. And just like we talk about with democracy, when we talk about the great law of peace of the Haudenosaunee being the ancient instructions for how to improve our own democracy, since our democracy is based on the great law of peace of the Haudenosaunee. We just need to put back in these ancient ways into the things we're doing now, because we're kind of doing things like halfway, and we're doing it often with an eye to what's going to make the most profit, what's going to make the most money. So I thank you again, Phil, for agreeing to be on, and I'm going to turn it over to you to just talk about this brilliant film you've done.
Well, thank you. And it's all my pleasure to be on your program, Maddi. So I was led into this. I mean, this film was sort of given to me. And by the way, I'm co-director. The other director is Kevin Tomlinson. And so, but I started the film mainly because I had, during my sojourn in the developing world, doing human rights stories for tribal and indigenous people around the world, I started meeting the healers in those communities. And the first one I met was the Oracle of Tibet, the Nechung Oracle. Some people call him the Dalai Lama's Oracle. And I watched him in ceremony go into trance, do something like, I guess you would call it speaking in tongues.
Right.
He started speaking in a different voice. The monks around him started writing down everything he was saying. And then he more or less collapsed, and they had to carry him out of the room. So it was just, my eyes were wide open. I hadn't seen anything quite like that before. And I got to interview him 2 days later. And one of the questions I asked is, how was he chosen to be what they call the Akutan? The Akutan is the physical person who transmits the spirit. It's the Nechung Oracle, which is the people.
Did I lose you
So I
there?
asked him, how were you chosen to... Are you okay?
Yeah, I think I lost you for a second there. Sorry. Can you just repeat that when you asked him how? Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I asked him, how were you chosen to be the Akutan? And I don't know if you got the explanation of what a Akutan is. A Akutan to the Tibetans is an individual that can go into an altered state and channel, if you will, disembodied spirit. In this case, he brings in the spirit of the Tibetan, the protective spirit of the Tibetan people.
Wow.
So anyway, I asked him how he was chosen to be a Akutan, and in fact to be the most famous Akutan in the Tibetan right now in the Tibetan culture. And he described what I might call a psychological crisis. He was hearing voices. His personality was shifting and changing. He had been a very mild-mannered guy, and he was doing things that weren't like him. He was feeling these electric shocks going up his body. He thought he was dying.
Wow.
But the monks around him saw his symptoms and realized he had the potential to be a Akutan. And they put him through this process of teaching him how to manage those extreme sensitivities and those extreme emotions. And then they asked him to visit the Dalai Lama, and he went to the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama said, "Are you sure you want to do this?"
Wow.
And he said yes, and he's now the Nechung Oracle. I interviewed him. That was back in 1994 when I first met him, and he's 55 now. He was 30 back then. So anyway, that was just interesting to me. And then a couple of years later, I was doing work in Kenya for Amnesty International, and I met a woman there, a 35-year-old woman who was a mother of 5 kids, who had one of these crises when she was... And in her case, she was hearing voices, having visions. She thought she was dying, feeling very ill. Her aside and told her she had this special sensitivity, and helped guide her through her initiation. And now she's a famous healer and predictor in the Samburu tribe of northern Kenya. So, after that, when I was doing my work, I would ask, when I was in a community, wherever it was, I would ask, who are your healers? And can I speak with them? Or who are your visionaries here? And I've interviewed at least 40 around the world in every continent. And mainly, they're chosen by having a crisis. And sometimes it's a physical crisis, like an intense fever or something like that. But the ones I interviewed, by and large, most of them had had a psychological crisis. And they were typically taken aside and told they had a special sensitivity and given a mentor, which was usually another shaman, who had been through the same thing when they were in their youth. So they had somebody that had experienced what they were experiencing, and so they could calm them down and let them know that they can work their way through this, and then they become, a very valuable asset to the community. They become the healers and the visionaries. So it's a very different thing than what I saw, when I did the film. And this is a long way of getting around to why I did this film.
That's okay.
I started a film on meditation, mindfulness. I had started meditating about 5 or 6 years before, and I just said, let's do a film that just interviews a bunch of people to see what they're getting out of it, what it does for them, what is difficult about it, just everything about mindfulness. It's going to be a simple film. And the producer I was working with, Deborah, she sent me 3 people right off the bat to interview. And the second one was Adam. And Adam, at 20, much like the friend you were telling me about, had the way he described it, I went nuts. He had a psychological crisis, and his parents didn't know what to do. He was talking about things they couldn't understand.
Right.
He was telling his parents, "I have a formula that can, a mathematical formula that can solve all the family's problems," and they were just, what? And they'd never seen him in this state before. And so they took him to the doctor, and the doctor, he eventually ended up with a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist told him that he had a chemical imbalance of his brain, and right now there's no cure for it.
Right.
But there are medications you can take that will allow you to lead a semi-normal life.
Right, exactly.
And you'll probably be on these for the rest of your life. So that, all of a sudden, I thought back to all the shaman I had interviewed, all these healers, and I thought to myself, well, what advantage they have? Number one, they're told that they have a special sensitivity, a gift in a way.
Right.
Yeah, it's very difficult, but you can learn to manage it. You can recover. And not only can you recover, when you do, you will be much more powerful, and you will be a greater asset to the community, because you'll have these healing powers. So they're not given this, it's almost a hex to have somebody as powerful as a doctor when you're 20 years old saying you have a broken brain that can't recover.
Right.
And to give you a label, he got a bipolar label, and to give you a label that kind of makes you no longer a normal person. You're this kind of second-class citizen as a person with a mental illness.
Exactly. And that's really what we found in the community. And when I worked in the mental health field, that is exactly the way people were treated, like they were second-class citizens. We had a woman who was a physicist who had a nervous breakdown, ends up in our program, and she said one of the most profound things to me I've never forgotten. She said one of the things she hated the most about being mentally ill was the fact that everything she had once loved was now therapy. Music, art, dance, everything was therapy now.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing that happens and so now I've interviewed many people like Adam since the film came out. Adam in his first interview said something very interesting, and it sort of passed by me until I started hearing it from other people. He said when it first happened, it was incredible. It was so exciting. It was the first time I felt ultra connected to everyone and everything,
Yeah.
to the universe. It was like I was it, I was this was me. There was no ego boundaries. And then I went too far, and then it got scary. So, since the film came out, I've interviewed so many people that have had these crises. And many of the people I interview have navigated the crisis and can look back and talk about it.
Right.
And one of the things they say is, the people that scared me the most were the people that loved me the most.
Wow.
They didn't, they couldn't, whether it's the parents or a lover or somebody's boss or your best friends, you literally enter a different world when I've learned later that your ego boundaries kind of dissolve in this state. And it's really a state that the mystics talk about.
Yes.
And that feeling of being ultra connected to everyone and everything. And that's a spiritual experience. But other things happen at the same time that can really frighten you.
Yes.
And one of those things is when you try to explain what you're experiencing to somebody and all of a sudden you're talking gobbledygook to them because there's really no good language to explain it.
No.
And then the other thing that happens in that state, there's several common denominators I've heard over and over again. One is this feeling of connectedness. 2 is your creativity goes up. 3, your sense of time distorts. And your inhibitions go down. And but you can start. Do you know the word synchronicity?
Yes. Yes.
These weird coincidences start happening. And the other thing that's very interesting is that I've heard several people say it's like somebody turned up the volume on all my senses.
Yeah.
Colors became brighter. Sounds became more crisp. I could feel the energy and feelings of the people around me. So when somebody's in that state and a parent or a lover or whoever is in fear over their state, they pick up on that fear. And then all of a sudden they say, this isn't as wonderful as I thought it was.
Right.
There's something wrong here.
Yeah.
And then they can go into these fear states and spiral down into what we call psychosis.
Right. And the fault, like I think one of your guests said, I think it was Robert Thurman who said, the fault is not with the person. It's we have this psychotic society, So you've got a society that isn't explaining and isn't accepting this different way of thinking and looking at the world. And I love when you brought up the thing about timelessness, because now we know from quantum physics there is no time. Last week Em and I talked about the quote from Carlo Rovelli, who said the only way we can reconcile the universe right now is to admit that it's timeless. So it's interesting that a lot of what these people report in their alleged psychosis is actually sort of turning out to be the truth, and especially when you talk about that hypersensitivity. And when somebody has a guide through that, and that can become so important to a community. When I was watching the film again, there's a part where you talk about, or someone in the film talks about, how if this is a gift, and the gift is for the community, and if this gift isn't used, if this healing power isn't used, then it's gonna turn on the person. And I remember in working with the Haudenosaunee, and working with, and not just them, but several elders say sort of a similar thing about tobacco. The Haudenosaunee used to use tobacco to make a tea that would clear your lungs. And when the tobacco, of course, as we all know, is used incorrectly, just for pleasure, not as medicine, as a product, as a commodity, it gives you lung cancer. And the elders would describe that as the medicine turns on you. So these people that are really a gift to our culture are being led into their own demise because we're not accepting them. We're not thinking maybe they have something to offer. And especially, I was also so thrilled that you brought up the DSM-5 that we're now in. When I took abnormal psychology, I'm not a psychologist. I just took it when I was in college. And so that would have been like, let's say, 1973. And I distinctly remember him showing us the continuum of human behavior. And it was a big, long continuum. And at one end of the continuum was like a little tiny piece that was, unusual or non-normal behavior. That was abnormal behavior. On the one end, it was the kind of behavior that made people depressed and lonely and suicidal. And way at the other end was the kind of behavior that made them violent. And then everything in between was normal, and it was long. It was like a little tiny thing on each end. And now, like you brought out in the film, the DSM-5 has gone from 106 diagnoses to like 300 and something diagnoses, to that one of your guests says on the film, if we had everybody looked at by the standards of the DSM-5, everybody would have some kind of mental illness. And the continuum of what we consider normal, I know from friends who are therapists, is shrunk way down. Now, if you looked at that continuum, the either end is much bigger than the part in the middle that's considered normal behavior. And that's our fault. That's not the fault of these people that are thinking and acting and feeling differently than what we think is normal. We have no normal anymore.
Yeah. The DSM, the first one, it's written by the American Psychiatric Association members. And the first one came out in 1952, as you said, with 106. They called them not disorders at that time, but reactions. The second one that came out a couple of years after that, they started calling them disorders. But anyway, on 5, there's things like if you lose a spouse, say you're married for 40 or 50 years, you lose a spouse, and you grieve and are in depression for more than 2 weeks, that's considered severe depression, and it's recommended that you start a medication.
Yes,
treatment.
exactly.
And that is a normal process that anybody that's going through an experience like that needs the time to go and process
exactly
a loss of that magnitude.
And in indigenous cultures, you are given a year. There's a year of mourning. You look at the Lakota, and they set up a teepee that faces to the west because that's their direction of death. And people go in and out of that teepee, talk to their loved one for a whole year. And there's a big ceremony setting it up, a big ceremony taking it down. And every culture has these mourning ceremonies that are. Even in Judaism, even back in Christianity, people used to take a longer time to mourn and to deal with the loss of someone significant. And when you look at at these condolence ceremonies that people used to use, a lot of them have applications today. A lot of them are being reused in tribal situations to help people with PTSD, to help people who are addicted, because it's all about the community coming together around the people and
Yeah.
helping them heal. And I think,
Yeah.
especially, you mentioned there's a gentleman in your film who was in the Army and talked about how he had these problems coming back. Well, if your community's already predisposed to helping you return, they already know that going to war, seeing these horrific things, doing these horrific things is going to damage your soul and damage your psyche. So we're prepared to receive you in a loving way and let you grieve the fact that you have been in this situation. We're going to grieve with you the fact that you lost part of your soul. And even, we have soul retrieval ceremonies in many different cultures, in the Mexican cultures, so that there's a recognition by the community that, of course, a person in these situations is going to suffer, but we're going to be there for you. We're going to make that commitment. The idea that these things can be solved just by throwing money at them is ridiculous. And that's where we, the people, have to shift our own thinking. It's not about, we've said this about education too. It's not always about how much money you're giving somebody. It's about your commitment as a community to helping the people who live in your community. That's that I loved about your film, the fact that is a theme over and over again.
Yeah, community is so important. And, Sebastian Junger wrote a book called Tribes. And he's somebody that's been to war and experienced that. And he said, what really happens, today, of all the people in the armed services that go abroad to war, only about 10% actually see any battle at all. Most of them are in support positions.
Right.
And he said the PTSD, what it is when they're in these situations in war, they form these tight bonds with their troop. Say there's 20 or 30 people that are very close together, and they all know each other. They all have to have each other's back. They have to. You have these reciprocal relationships where you're sharing and doing things with each other, and what the PTSD is coming back to our society where community has somewhat been downgraded, not downgraded, but has disappeared.
Disappeared.
The thing that gave us a lot of community in the past when I was a kid, was religion, the churches.
Yes. Yes.
Well, we're not going to church much anymore, all the young people. So that basis, I'm not saying that's wrong or right. I'm just saying the one thing, no matter what the dogma was, the one thing it did do is give us a place to commune with each other.
Exactly.
And I happen to grow up as a Mormon. And, we called each other brother and sister. That was the first word, brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so. And the thing that I really noticed in my 30 years going back and forth between tribal communities, small indigenous communities, and my community back here is I came away realizing how disconnected I am. I don't know. I live on an island outside of Seattle. I don't know a lot of my neighbors that are.
Yeah.
Some of them are right next door, and the thing is with the small groups. And by the way, this is how our brains evolved in these small hunter-gatherer groups over a 200,000-year period when the first Homo sapien appeared and agriculture started.
Right.
But we are wired for community. We are wired for being with people. And where I go to these small communities, There's no grocery stores. There's no daycare centers to
Right.
take care of the kids. There's no old age homes. There's no Social Security. The only thing they have are their relationships with one another. And, you'll go into these little huts and, there'll be the mother and father, maybe 6 kids. And I'm thinking of one in particular, 6 kids and an orphan boy that they've adopted, and the grandparents and the great-grandmother.
Right.
All in this one hut together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was thinking of a case when I was in Irian Jaya, which is the kind of primitive part of Papua New Guinea. It's the Indonesian half that's very, very remote. And I was near a hut like this, and the great-grandmother was actually very sick and dying, and she actually died the 3rd day I was there. But while she was there in that state of, people knew that she was in her 90s and she was dying, and they knew that. But people were coming out of the mountains, and these huts were like a quarter of a mile apart, and coming in and being with her and holding her and talking to her, stroking her hair. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I'm sure they were telling her how much they loved her.
Oh, yeah.
And, it was about 3 months after that, I had a job in New York documenting an elder care facility. And it was very clean, and the people were there, many of them in wheelchairs, sitting quietly, being taken care of by paid attendants. And I thought the difference in the soul in those two places was just it was just so obvious to me. Not that I don't want to come down on the elder care facilities in our country.
Oh, you can come down on them. I'm fine with that.
They're they're a poor substitute for extended families being with each other when somebody's going through a transition like that.
Yes, they are.
So anyway, I think I came away feeling we're very disconnected from each other. We're very disconnected from ourselves.
Yep.
Mainly, one of the things we are, unfortunately, we're bombarded with about 3,000 ads a day, they say nowadays.
Yeah.
And it's usually telling you, how to look, what to own to be successful.
Right.
It can take you away from your authenticity. So
Absolutely.
We're not that connected to ourselves, and we're certainly not connected to the natural world like the people I visit are, because they have to know it intimately just to survive. They have to grow or hunt all their food. And on top of that, they infuse that world with spirit energy.
Yes.
There's spirits of the mountains, there's spirits of the rivers, there's spirits of the animals. They pay a lot of attention to their ancestor spirits. And I used to think, well, it's just primitive thinking to think there's spirits and all that. But no.
It's not.
That is you could look at it as a metaphor, as a way to deeply connect us to the earth. And our disconnection from the earth and from nature is very possibly going to be our undoing as a species.
Oh, definitely.
And
I mean, it's very interesting to me too that in all this talk about climate change, we mentioned this a few weeks ago on the show. We have indigenous friends who can't get a seat at the table, and these are the people that really hold the key to how we can save ourselves. I mean, the Earth is going to be here. It's us, and it's our disconnection from looking at the world as us and as us as an embedded part of this planet that's going to do us in if we don't start listening to these people that hold the knowledge of how to get back to this. And that's really, when we talk about that connection to nature, there's, even in geology now, they talk about how life is formed in the ocean, life was formed on, in the hot springs, and how we evolved all life here on Earth from bacteria, basically, in the TED Talk I was watching after yours. and this young lady from Australia is talking about we have to re-recognize our connection to this planet. We are intimately of this planet. And
We are
indigenous people have always known this, and the rituals and that go along with this recognition create that community you were talking. It's like you said, whether you're going to a church of any particular Western faith or you're going to some other spiritual practice, the idea of these rituals is really to give us community. I mean, that is one of the basic purposes that people had for creating religions to begin with. I mean, everybody talks about, we're just explaining where everything in nature came from, and it's just a big lie, and it's a big myth, and it's a big this, and it's a big that. Well, look deeper. A lot of what's going on with what you're talking about is that, we're so on the surface, we're so bombarded, and everything is so fast. And at the same time that we've got so much stuff, material stuff coming at us, we've got like your film points out, a $40 billion a year antidepressant business. We're not even going to talk about the fact that they don't work right here and now. We've mentioned that before on the phone, but, on this show. But you've got this $40 billion antidepressant business. You've got this huge increase in 10 to 14-year-olds committing suicide. And we're still saying to ourselves that there's got to be a drug out there. There's no drug that is going to solve these problems. It's us.
Right.
It's us going back to the old ways of community, of caring, if you've got a $40 billion a year antidepressant business, that means you've got millions of people, 4.5 million people just in this country alone that are unhappy. The question you should be asking isn't what's the new drug? It's why is everybody so damn miserable? That's the question you need to ask, and that's not only the question you ask in this film, it is the answer you give in the film.
Yeah, isolation is something that our brains are not wired for.
No.
And you take the people that do these horrible acts of gun violence in our country.
Right.
They're usually pretty isolated individuals.
Yes.
But I want to say one thing about indigenous people because I don't want to over romanticize them.
No, it's not.
I've been in these communities enough to know they're human beings like we are.
Yeah.
They have to overcome their jealousies, their what we've all grown up with. As we mature, we learn how to handle things like that better. But they have to do it.
Yeah.
They don't have lawyers that stand in between. If there's an argument, they can't hire that out.
Yeah.
They've got to solve that argument. And I've seen a tribe gather with a couple that was having problems and help them work out their differences.
Yeah.
Because in a small community like that, they cannot tolerate disharmony. It threatens their survival,
right.
Literally.
Right.
And so but here's the thing I want to say. If you go down into the lower Omo Valley of Ethiopia, there's about 13 or 14 tribes living the way they have for centuries, even millennia. And they have that, all those wonderful things, this close connection with each other, and watching each other's back, and connected to nature, and connected to and to themselves. They go through rites of passage. Their lives are much simpler than ours. I mean, it isn't like they have to be educated for 25 years and then decide what they're going to do.
Right.
Kids 4 years old are guarding the crops from the baboons that could steal everything overnight and wipe out a year's harvest. But the every once in a while, I lose my train of thought.
That's okay. The same thing happens to me all the time. So I have millions of notes.
But I really wanted to make a point. Oh, yes. But those 14 tribes, many of them are at war with one another. So their circles of compassion are limited to their little tribes.
Right.
And so what we have done in this country has brought a lot of tribes together, and fairly successfully.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying they have all the answers. We need to go back to living like they live. No, we've got a lot of things that work for us. But we have thrown out a lot of things that are very necessary. So when you look back at these pre-modern cultures, that's the thing I take away is connection, relationships. And they're living in these communities. And by the way, these communities are starting to spring up around the world. They're called eco communities.
Yes.
And they are built around usually around personal growth. And if somebody makes you mad, or all of a sudden does something that you think is horrible, you don't attack them. You look at what was it inside you that got triggered? What made you react to that?
Right.
It would just be a neutral thing if there wasn't something inside of you that's afraid of that, or had been yelled at that way in your childhood, or had some previous trauma. So they use this community, this tight community, and conflict resolution for their own spiritual growth, their own growth. And they try to do away with what torpedoed so many of these communes in the 60s during my generation, when everybody went back to the land, and peace, love, and rock and roll, and drugs. Many times they were headed by a male guru. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of patriarchal, and it was this hierarchy. And they failed. A lot of them failed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember that.
So it's this time around, the ones I'm going to visit are headed by females.
Interesting.
But
it's like the Haudenosaunee with the clan mothers. When after they went to war, and they reinstated their clan mother system with having the clan mothers run the villages and approve the laws and choose the leaders, and it's to recreate that balance that they saw was necessary, because when the men were picking the leaders when they were at war, when it was about revenge, they only wanted leaders that wanted war and revenge. And then when the peacemaker came and worked with everybody and said, okay, we gotta get this stuff back in balance here. Phil, I have a question for you from Lisa, who is listening right now, and she wanted to know that you mentioned mystics being ultra connected to everyone and everything, just like people who experience altered states or psychosis. Do you have any specific mystics that you can point us to who speak of such experiences? Mystics that we can study and read about, or read his or her teachings? Anybody specifically?
I haven't studied the mystics of the world, but St. Francis of Assisi, and I mean some of the I'm very familiar with the Tibetan culture,
Right.
and the Tibetans use a lot of meditation to go into those states. And again, we're talking about ego dissolution states where your ego boundaries somewhat get blurry and can disappear. It's when a shaman goes through their initiation, they refer to it as the little death. It's like the concept of who you think you are. And that's held in our brain. It's a mental model. We get it by thinking, okay, I was born here and I did this and now I'm this and now I do this for a living. And we define ourselves with this narrative, which we hold in our brain, in a certain part of our brain, actually called the default mode network. And when that goes away, that sense of separateness goes away. That's when they get this mystical feeling of being ultra connected, because you become everything, you become nothing and everything at the same time. I mean, people try to explain it, and it's almost impossible to explain.
Yeah.
And but those states can be reached by, like the Tibetans use just hours of meditation. Some Tibetans that I've seen, I met one woman that went into a cave when she was 12. I met her when she was 90 in that cave. I didn't meet her, actually. Somebody had to go in and take her picture for me because she didn't want to be meeting a foreigner. So they do these intense meditations, and what they are doing it for is to get over self-cherishing and self-grasping, and self-centeredness, and there's various ways of doing that. And right now, there's this huge renaissance going on in the study of psychedelics. And psychedelics, LSD, when it was first discovered, was called a psychomimetic, not a psychedelic, because it mimicked a psychosis. And it has a lot of the same things that happen when you're on especially a guided psychedelic trip with either psilocybin or LSD, that are being studied right now, and they're mapping the brains of the people under the influence of these compounds. And they have some of the same things I've been hearing from people that have had a psychological crisis.
Wow.
This sense of unity, creativity going up, thinking outside of the box. Sometimes their inhibitions they lose their inhibitions. That's what happened back in the 60s. Some people would literally jump out a window thinking they could fly.
Right.
Their normal reality is totally gone. It's just very different. And so those states happen in meditation. They happen under psychedelics. They can happen in a psychological crisis. They can happen. You can nurture that state of diminished ego influence, diminished sense of separateness, by devoting yourself to a life of service of others.
Right.
Taking you out of yourself. Anything that will do that will start to give you that sense and that realization that we are all interconnected and interdependent, and we are all one. I mean, that's a cliche, but it's
not a cliche.
It's really,
it's
really
the truth.
Yeah, I'm beginning to see it's more and more the truth. So doing this work I've been doing has just been my spiritual journey, because I'm learning so much just by talking to the people that now the neuroscientists that are doing the fMRI imaging of the brain and seeing where our sense of time is located in which network, and that network that holds a sense of time, again, it's the default mode network, also is where the mental model of our self is held.
Yep.
And so it's just kind of fascinating to all of a sudden see science come around. And
I'm totally with you on this, Phil.
Yeah.
It is. It's like you can really see the merging.
Quantum physics is doing it as well.
Yep, exactly. So, Lisa, I'm going to recommend to you the book Hildegard of Bingen, who was a Christian mystic, but the one by Matthew Fox. Brilliant book. If you want to read about her mystical journey, and of course, just about anything on St. Francis, like you said. And then, I mean, outside of our culture, very difficult to find anything outside of Western culture, but I really think that book is wonderful for what you might be looking for. And Phil, we only have about 3 minutes left, so I want to mention first that the Crazy Wise Conversations on your website, but I want you to give the website, let us know where the film can be seen. I saw it on Gaia for those of you that have a subscription, but where else can we find it, Phil?
Yeah, it's on our website. And,
great,
and
which is?
crazywisefilm.com.
Right, and I'll post that later. Crazywisefilm.com.
So you could stream it, you could download it. It's on Gaia, it's on Food Matters. Gaia just bought Food Matters. So, so they fused. And if anybody wants to do a community screening, I love doing community screenings because we can go into deep conversations about what they see in the film, and I love going to them when I get a chance.
Well, you have to let us know when you're on the East Coast. I'm going to be in touch with you after the show. Our friend Campbell Dalglish, who's also a documentary filmmaker who's been on the show before, has a small art theater, and he does stuff like that. He'd love to film screen your film.
To.
Let's do a community screening. That'll be way fun. So anything else, any final closing words, closing thoughts, Phil, before we have to sign off here?
Yeah, it's so important that we understand some of these states that, especially these young kids away at school, go into, because they're some of our brightest and most talented. And they're ending up homeless and in prison.
Yes.
That's where the majority of them end up. It's a huge tragedy.
It really is.
And spread the word.
Spread the word. Really, we need to start looking at not just. I don't feel like community is an alternative remedy. It's amazing to me what we call alternative. It's alternative to like be loving and caring and take someone into your home. You know, I mean, like that's alternative. I remember when I first started working in that program, we had a doctor from South Korea who, when he retired, said he was going back to South Korea because he can't help us. We're the only country in the world where people don't live with their families, where they think they have to strike it out on their own without the support of 3 generations in one household, which sounds weird to us, but actually when you look at what's going on, especially with kids now, they're lost and they want that back. They want that sense of community. When we do the program on Native Americans at the end of every day, most of the kids will say to us, I want to live like that. There's a reason for that. Yeah. There really is. It really touches something. We're wired for it, exactly. Well, thank you again so much, Phil. We're going to put that community screening together. I'll be in touch.
That'd be wonderful, Maddi.
I'll do it. And to all of you listening out there, as always, peace, love, and understanding. Thank you.